All right, well, good morning, everyone. Glad to see you all out here on this Saturday morning to continue the discussion that we got started yesterday. Yesterday, we were able to look at some of the themes of advocacy, theology, research in the role of helping to know better about food and other issues and other affecting folks around the world and how we're involved in these things. This morning we get to take a little bit of a turn, and we're going to have two panels. Our first panel, kicking us off here this morning, is Emerging Themes in Local Food Movements. And then our second panel is going to be at 11 o'clock. That'll be our last panel of the symposium, which is going to be looking at emerging themes in global food production and distribution. So we've got local food movements this morning, and then we're going to be talking about global food. So I recommend that as you're listening to the panelists, if you have a question, maybe write it down, and there will be a time for questions at the second half of each panel. So, all right, let's get it started.
Well, welcome to all of you this morning, and welcome to our panel on emerging themes in local food movements, food sovereignty, security, and generosity. So I'd like to start out by introducing our panelists to you, beginning with Katarina Friesen. Katarina is one of our own Hunger alumni with a BA from Wheaton in anthropology. She did her Hunger internship in the Philippines, where she worked with and was welcomed into the homes of indigenous Filipino farmers. And since graduating, Katarina has been living and working in California around themes of hunger and agriculture. She is currently coordinating a nonprofit community garden that is a ministry of a United Methodist Church. And she is also co-leading a participatory planning project funded through the USDA. Our next panelist is Mark Haugen. He is the Latin America Operations Director for Willow Creek Church here in the suburbs of Chicago. Mark Haugen also graduated from Wheaton College in 2000 with a BA in Christian education. While here at Wheaton, he participated in Honduras Project, and he also did a hunger internship working with World Relief's microfinance program in Honduras. Since graduating, he has worked with the Latino community in the Chicago area in retail banking, construction, and public education. He and his wife, Stephanie, served with Willow Creek's local church partners in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic for 3 years, and they moved back to this area in 2008 when he took on his current position with Willow Creek. So he now works to lead Willow Creek in establishing new church partnerships with networks of holistically minded churches in El Salvador, Guatemala, Bolivia, and Chile. And finally, we have Arloa Sutter, and she is a visionary leader and founder of Breakthrough Urban Ministries, an organization in Chicago that partners and walks alongside those affected by poverty to develop skills and open doors of opportunity. So Breakthrough has many, many services. The ministry works on providing shelter, hot meals, counseling, and supportive services for the homeless. They also have youth and family service programs. Arloa graduated from Moody Bible Institute, and she is an associate pastor at River City Community Church. So welcome to you all. So I would like us to start just by allowing all of our panelists to speak briefly on your experiences and how they are connected to local food, both production and distribution, and sort of how you've become involved in that. Okay.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. After graduating from Wheaton with a degree in anthropology, I really wanted to do something with my hands. And so after a hunger experience in the Philippines, where I was able to go to the farm of my host mom in an indigenous area in northern Luzon, and really witnessed there her love for the place and for the land and for the community there, and was really inspired by that host family's decision to stay rooted and connected to the place despite all of the pressures to go abroad to bring in more income for their families, and that they chose to stay there. And when they commissioned me back home here, they said, apply what you've learned here in the Philippines. So that was one of the things that stayed with me the most was really that love for a place, and I realized I didn't have that in my life, and I couldn't think of a place that I could call home because I'd moved around so much growing up, and so really I started to reflect on what home is for me, and found that farming and the process of working with the earth was something that I had learned there and that I could take away and I could practically apply. And I think our generation in particular is exhausted from abstraction and really wants something real and tangible to do and touch and work with. And so that's why we see a large growth in young farmers, urban farmers, the youth working in agriculture. And so I'm part of that, and moved out to California to work as an intern on a small organic farm through a faith-based internship project called the Abundant Table Farm Project. So I worked on an organic farm for a year and developed a community-supported agriculture program, or a box share program, in conjunction with a campus ministry program at University Channel Islands, and lived in community with 4 other young adult interns in a farmhouse in rural Oxnard, California. And after that, I felt that God was again calling me to stay in the place, and I didn't know what was going to come next. So I balanced a couple of part-time jobs and eventually came into my position where I am right now as a coordinator of a nonprofit, a community garden that's a ministry of a United Methodist Church. And it's located on an acre of land, and we're working on several different projects. Most of the food that we grow goes to local food pantries, and volunteers share the produce among themselves as well. And we don't have plots, it's more of a shared farm, so I help to coordinate that shared farm-style community garden. And yeah, so that's a little bit of what I've been doing since graduating in 2009.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Mark Haugen, as she shared, and been out of here for 10 years now, and worked for 5 years here in the Chicagoland area, a few different areas, then had the opportunity to really get back to, I think, some passions that were awakened while at Wheaton through Honduras Project and hunger, and moved with my wife to the Dominican Republic and got on a pretty steep learning curve, and I'm continually on that steep learning curve, and it's exciting. And with Willow Creek, had the opportunity to essentially just get envisioned by incredible church leaders with a holistic vision for the church and a practice, and really just a praxis and a theology. And I think today, anything I have to share is really just to come from the wisdom of some of these leaders on the ground. And one of the things that many of the churches in Central America, kind of the Andean region of South America and the Caribbean, where we're partnered as Willow Creek, that all of them are facing are challenges around food and water insecurity. And you see a lot of different creative approaches to addressing food and water insecurity, and you see successes and failures, but you see a definite drive, and it's a drive based on a felt need that, we've got to figure out some way to do this self-sustainably. There's, in that context, what we've tended to see is that there's not the resources for food assistance programs, and so the model that we've explored with our partners has really been around small plat agriculture and cooperatives, and it's really the only approach in most of those contexts. And so we've seen some exciting things happen, to say the least. Just to share a few of the notable ones that I've seen in El Salvador, in communities that are plagued by the Mara Salvatrucha, one of the biggest gangs that really controls the drug trade up from Colombia all the way into Los Angeles in the southern United States. We're seeing communities through tomato planting and organic farming get into parts of the barrio that they haven't been in 15 years. I was just on the phone yesterday with one of our partners, and he says, yeah, we're digging in where we've never been able to be because these gang members need to feed themselves as well. And so you're seeing these sorts of things where the church, by just being the church and helping basically provide just assistance and helping to feed themselves on their own, people on their own small plots, not only are people being fed, but you're seeing Christ's name proclaimed, and you're seeing transformation at multiple levels. So it's an exciting justice cause as well as food security initiative. You know, in Bolivia and in Costa Rica, we're seeing churches build greenhouses behind their church, and through that they're bringing fresh fruits and vegetables to the members of those co-ops. But then we're also seeing that their children's programs, now instead of just serving rice and potatoes and noodles, they're serving fresh vegetables. Agreements from local schools to buy those fresh fruits and vegetables. And it's this power of the local church. You know, it's volunteers. There's not a lot of overhead. There's not a lot of operational expenses. And so it's efficient and it's effective. Guatemala and Zambia, I've seen churches that'll do things like have a large tilapia pond or a large, it was funny, I was in Zambia and they had just taken a house and they just filled it with chickens. It was easier and cheaper to rent a small home than it was to build a chicken pen, so they just filled a house with chickens. Another church, they basically provided technical assistance in farming corn, and everybody, they gave back a 10%, and now the feeding program, Willow Creek was paying all kinds of tens of thousands of dollars to feed kids, basically just mealy meal, kind of an ugali or an enchima. Now the church members are growing all their own corn and giving a 10% back, and they feel, it's just amazing to see. I can just, story after story, and it's really just the ingenuity and innovation of these local food movements in the South. And I wish I could tell there's a magic silver bullet formula. It's really about a commitment of a small group of people and then figuring out how to build a sustainable business model around that, whether that's individual small plot in your own patio or sharecropping, or maybe you have a small tract of land that you actually own. And sometimes it's cooperative, and there's different challenges in those different models. But it's been exciting to see. So I just come today bringing that perspective of what's going on, and I think there's encouraging stories to be told. And we up here, I think, have got so much we can learn to apply in our own context as we do gardens and things for our own, food security initiatives for our own under-resourced populations in the states. So I think as we continue to shore up that dialogue north-south, we all continue to learn from each other's successes and failures.
Well, I'm Arloa, and I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and so my father eventually had to be on disability and get Social Security, but we always had food. We always had our gardens and our fruit trees, and we grew vegetables. You could make anything from potatoes, and tomatoes that you canned, and so that was kind of our way of life. And then I came to Chicago. I've been in Chicago now for about 35 years, and was just kind of stunned by the people sorting through trash cans to find food, and asking for your to-go bag as you came out of a restaurant. And so I think my life has been a kind of a journey of trying to understand that and to see if how as a Christian you respond to that kind of poverty. And so in '92 I opened a storefront room, and everything I started Breakthrough Urban Ministries, which has always been centered around food. Initially, we put on a pot of coffee and started serving lunch in our church storefront room, and people began to bring in, soup and spaghetti and sandwiches. And it was around this place of breaking bread together that my eyes were open to so many scriptures and Jesus' passion. For instance, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, and that being almost a criteria for whether we enter into the kingdom prepared for us, and kind of struggling with what does that mean, and realizing that as a believer, if I have food and there are hungry people And I don't do anything, that faith without works is dead, and I probably need to take my spiritual pulse to see if I'm really a follower of Christ. And so it's so integrally related to one's walk of faith. And I think of Isaiah 58, where the people of God were struggling because they felt so distant from God and so estranged, and God wasn't hearing their prayers, and they were trying to do everything that they knew how to do, and they were fasting and praying and just not getting anywhere. And the Lord said, is this the kind of fasting that I accept? And you're quarreling, you're exploiting your workers in sweatshops, and the chocolate that you eat and the coffee that you drink. Do you understand? I don't hear you because you're exploiting your workers. And isn't this the kind of fast that I demand? And it's to share your food with the hungry. And so all through Scripture, as I've now reflected upon it and in a setting of poverty and working with homeless adults, I see God's compassionate care for meeting physical needs as well as spiritual needs. And really that hunger is a place where we come together in reciprocal relationships, and we break bread together, and we learn from one another, and we share. So I'm kind of troubled. I have more questions than answers, so I'm glad to be around people who know a lot, because I'm struggling. I recently read Bob Lupton's Toxic Charity, and we've seen the book When Helping Hurts, and we look at farmers in developing countries who have been run out of business because we come in with all of our charity aid, and they no longer have a market, and I see this even in my neighborhood. Now Breakthrough is centered in East Garfield Park, which is an impoverished community on the west side of Chicago. And we have what we call our Fresh Market Food Pantry, and it's run by the neighborhood. 140 volunteers from the neighborhood run it. The director of it is from the neighborhood, and it's in this context where half of the people are eligible for or are receiving LINK, which is the food stamp program. There are probably more than that who are eligible. The city map of food deserts shows that East Garfield Park is 29.9%, so you could say 30, 1 out of 3 probably, residents in our neighborhood experiences food insecurity, which means at some point in the month they don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And so it's in this context that we run this fresh market, and we try to make it very interactive, and people can earn points if they attend workshops, and we have Cabrini Green Legal Aid in there collaborating with us to give legal advice and expungements of felonies, and trying to work with banks to provide financial management groups and nutrition classes and healthy recipes. And yet I see it only growing, and it breaks my heart. Over the holidays, we have these meal baskets that we give out for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we have to limit, and we have to sign people up, and thousands would come and stand in line. And so we distributed about 1,000 at each of those meals, and I'm scratching my head going, wow, is this really helping, and how do we manage that? And so, we're looking at things like creating a neighborhood co-op where people actually put a few dollars in to be part of a co-op, where now it's a neighborhood-run resource cooperative, where a part of that is the access to the fresh market. We're encumbered a little bit by rules from the food bank, the Greater Chicago Food Depository, which says we can't sell food, so we have to kind of do a workaround, and Bob Lupton's book was helpful on that. His book on toxic charity, about this notion of a resource co-op. How do we provide food in an area where, and I live there, I see my neighbors coming with their carts, from our fresh market, and how can we work together to create gardens and bring in the farmers markets? We have some, but we're doing a little of that, and what can we do to grow maybe vertical gardens in some of these abandoned buildings with tilapia tanks at the bottoms, and so I'm on a journey to try to continue to go in community development, we talk about going up the river, where downstream you can really find people who are in need and rescue them, but you continually want to go up the river and find out why people are hungry and how can we alleviate this kind of stress. And I could go on and on. It has a lot to do with economic development and really a holistic approach to teaching young people about fruits and vegetables and nutrition. So that's it.
Well, thank you all very much for that. That gives us a good sense of the experiences that you're speaking from, and I hope that you'll continue to speak out of those experiences as we continue on in the panel. I want to bring up one of the themes that we talk about in the title of the panel, which is food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is a concept of food, access to food, and food production that was developed by Via Campesina, an organization of peasant farmers around the world. It's international. And I'm going to read the definition of food sovereignty off of the Via Campesina website, which is that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It develops a model of small-scale, sustainable production benefiting communities and their environment. It puts the aspirations, needs, and livelihoods of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And I know this is a concept that you are familiar with and that you consider in terms of your own work. So I was just wondering, how have you seen this concept at work, in sort of the everyday of your contexts? And what are the implications of considering food production in terms of sovereignty as compared to or in addition to food security? Can you parse that out for us a little bit?
Read the last part again.
Yeah, thanks. So what are the implications of considering food production in terms of sovereignty, this idea of sovereignty, as compared to food security, or in addition to food security?
I don't know if I understand all that, but I just know I have a friend who is working really hard. She's a PhD in nutrition, and she understands the food chain process a lot, and she's been working with Chipotle. So recently, I think it was during the Grammys, did any of you see this Chipotle commercial where they had this farmer and the pigs? You got to look on YouTube and look for Chipotle, this commercial, and it shows this farmer, and he's got his nice little pigs and everything, and then all of a sudden the pigs are on this chain and they're pumping them up with all this stuff, and they're oozing this green muck out, and I hear stories of the food chain and what happens to these genetically altered products, and I'm seeing the young girls developing early, and I'm thinking, oh, there's these hormones pumped into these chickens to get their breasts to enlarge, so that, but the Chipotle commercial at the end, it's like he's coming back home to the farm, and I really think we have to stand up, and I'm from a farm. The farm in Iowa has changed dramatically, and I think we have to bring it back home. I think we have to teach one another. There's lots of empty lots in my neighborhood, and there's we could all put pots on the porches and really begin to take ownership again of food production. And all that I wanted to say is that my friend, through her work with Chipotle, I think has raised their awareness to the fact that she's brought change to a major food supplier, And I think we can do this. I think we have to take control of some of the corporate greed that I think can impinge on what we eat. And I'll just end with this other thing. We have this group of junior high girls who started a vending machine business, and they have a dilemma because they want to sell, they want to make money, and they are making about $85 a month, these 5 girls, through their vending machine business. But the dilemma is, do they sell granola bars and juice, or do they sell Flamin' Hots and Coca-Cola? And you know what the market is. It's for the Flamin' Hots. And so I think we have to take control of educating our young people and protecting them from this destructive food, just like we protect people from tobacco.
I think I resonate with a lot of what you were just sharing there, and I think the tricky dynamic here, and there's 2 words you used in there that grabbed my attention when they were small scale and sustainable. To be sustainable, you need an effective business model, and one of the things that we know in business is that scalability and size is what often leads to profitability or sustainability. And so it goes right in the face of small scale. So we have to start asking ourselves some really hard questions, because how do you achieve sustainability or preferably profitability? Because profitable businesses, profitable small agricultural ventures are the ones that are going to really attract people to say, that's a viable job for me, that's worth my time because it's profitable. So how do you at a small scale get profitability in an agricultural initiative? That's really the question that has to be unpacked in every context. And it does look different in each context. And I think back to your question about sovereignty as opposed to food security, I think that, in food security models, those are more complex. We have, like I said, when you're talking about food security, you can be talking about the welfare systems and food aid and all the rest. But I think food sovereignty really harks us back to more of kind of a pre-industrial agricultural model where we're going to try to do it from the ground up and raise everything locally, organically. The young woman that's going to come babysit my kids this evening, she's going to live off her garden. She's 15, and she's going to live off her garden this summer. And so you're starting to see that there's a movement happening. The fact that, the girl that's going to babysit my kids, and I don't think she's out of the ordinary. If you got into the basement over at the train station right now in downtown Chicago at the Ogilvy Center, you see this whole raw food stand, and they were lined up for that, but they weren't lined up for hot dogs. And so there's something happening there, and that's important because we're going to need a market, because we've got to have a profitable business model around this for these small scale things to work. So I think that the tricky thing with all this is we've got to put our business lenses on, and we've got to start to say, how do we build profitable small scale business models, and how do we continue to build that mindset within our youth, particularly, that these are foods worth buying? Because we're not you're sure they're going to spend more for their food, but they're going to have a much healthier long-term life if they start to buy these healthier foods. So it's a tricky thing of building the market and then building the values and then being creative and innovative in the solutions, whether we're here or we're overseas or wherever we're at.
Food sovereignty is something that I've been learning a lot more about, and that's a growing movement, and that I think our panel is around local food movements, but really food sovereignty is a global food movement with campesina women, peasant farm worker women especially involved all over the world, coming from different countries, and they really do have a comprehensive vision for what food production, consumption, distribution could look like. And I'd encourage people to look up the 7 principles of food sovereignty that they came together a couple years back and came up with 7 food sovereignty principles. The first is that food is a basic human right. Second, agrarian reform. Third, protecting natural resources. Fourth, reorganizing food trade. The 5th is ending the globalization of hunger. 6 is social peace, and 7 is democratic control. So out of these 7 principles, we see that it's not just about food, but there are all these underlying issues around hunger, around food insecurity, around people's inability to access the resources that are in their own regions, And that I think a lot of the discussion up to this point has been around hunger and can we feed the world, and those are some of the big questions, and the kind of do we need to produce more, which I think most people are saying yes, but I think a more primary question that we want to ask and that food sovereignty raises is one that has been raised by an author, of course, that I really love, Wendell Berry, who says the primary question is not how the world will be fed, but who will control the land and therefore the wealth. So we're looking not only at the production of food, but who's controlling the land. I think you said, Arloa, who's upriver, and I think that's the deeper question, is who's upriver in our food systems. And we find that I think a lot of the issues that food sovereignty brings up is that for many people around the world, the reason that they're going hungry is that they don't have any say over the land, and it's not just about ownership, but access to be able to grow their own food, what you all have been talking about, being able to produce food from their own homes, backyards, and not only home-based domestic production, but businesses too, being able to make it into work and to really value that. And I think that food security is the first step, and it goes to the point saying everyone needs access to good food. Food sovereignty takes it to another level and says that food has to be culturally appropriate. We're not going to expect that everyone around the world is going to love the kinds of foods that we love, but we want to make foods diverse, to reflect all the diverse cultures around the world, and coming from the people who are growing and cooking them. In our garden, I've learned a lot about new foods from a region of Oaxaca, or a region of Mexico called Oaxaca, where a lot of the people come and work in our garden. They're growing things like papalo, alache, chile coyote, like all these different foods, squash, beans, different kinds of wild greens that were cultivated and that they brought seeds from and are planting. And they're teaching their children how to eat and grow and enjoy these kinds of foods in an area that is overwhelmed by fast food, really pressured, I think, by a lot of the corporate kind of food production in that area too. So, and I think behind us we have some beautiful pictures of farmers in this area at a community garden that are growing culturally appropriate food and who have access to land. Churches really have, I think, a crucial role to play in that, making land accessible to people who are dispossessed, to people who can come from the community who are refugees, immigrants, the strangers, Matt Sorens has said, and welcoming them, sharing their land, sharing resources. And I think for me too, a deeper question when you were talking about profitability is value. And if we only value food or our bodies or the land monetarily, then we'll ultimately abuse them and we'll ultimately destroy them in the end. But I think in addition to profitability is part of it, but I think there also has to be a different intrinsic value to it, and that's why I think coming from a faith perspective and from my Christian faith, being able to say that God created this earth as good, and before original sin there's original goodness, and that the land and food and we ourselves, we were created in a garden, and that the creation story starts with the garden, and in Revelations we see a city garden, a city overflowing with green spaces, trees for the healing of the nations, a river running through the city. So what does that look like, I wonder? This vision of what Arloa has been talking about, of people being able to produce food in the city, but this kind of the rural and nature and the city and civilization coming together in harmony. And I think those are some of my deeper questions.
So kind of going off this question of value and what is being valued, and as we consider ourselves and the land and food and the relationships between those things, what do you see as the role of the church in sort of communicating those new values, both in word and action? And how have you seen that at play in the context where you are? Because, Mark, you've shared some examples already but you're all working with churches, local churches, in these food projects that you have. And I'd just be curious to see how, whether those have been, you've seen the churches and your ministries benefiting each other, if there's a dialogue between them. Just what's the nature of that?
I would say that one thing that's great about the local church is that the local church offers it's a place to experiment things, you know. It gives us a context for, it's God's ordained community for all good things, I think, for many good things that God wants to do, God's projects in the world. He wants to use his local church. And just a couple days, I was talking to somebody in Guatemala, and they had this one church that we took a risk and invested, and they've got this tilapia cooperative they've got going, and now Free Presbyterian Church up and down that highway, back and forth between Quetzaltenango down to the coast, they're all interested, they're talking. There's 3 new churches that just saw that model, and now they want to follow, they want to copy, they want to do this in their own community, and they don't even want to do tilapia, they want to do irrigation systems, but they didn't think they could do it as a church until there was one church that modeled it. And so what's an amazing thing about the churches is that it's not just individual churches, we're all linked in our own little networks and stuff. So in this case, it's all the Presbyterian churches, but I've seen AG churches in El Salvador do this, or I've seen churches from a holistic mission network in the Dominican Republic. They're all see, and so they see each other's models, and then they try something. And what's neat is just the way theologies and beliefs and practices and new worship styles spread outward from a church sometimes. You see the same thing with these, churches infect each other in positive and negative ways. And so I think what's exciting is just the power of a local church to, disseminate ideas. Or we were just talking for breakfast at Arloa Breakthrough Ministries in Willow Creek. We've had conversations about a garden project together, and it's fun to see those connections, the way we can work not just as individual churches, but as the church.
Yeah, the church is the largest grassroots movement in the world, and we have a calling to care for people. And I think in the city, we've got, in my neighborhood, East Garfield Park, 1 out of every 3 lots is vacant. And the soil isn't very good, but we can build raised bed gardens. And I always have the struggle of, finding people who will step up and say, I'll take that on as a project, and I will, make sure that volunteers are held accountable and scheduled, and they're there to water and plant when the time comes. And so, we're praying to the Lord of the harvest to raise up workers to come in and help us till the soil and work alongside people in our neighborhood. I just also think we just can't miss the beauty of breaking bread with people. And I like to ask people, when's the last time you shared a meal with a poor person? I mean, someone so poor that they didn't know where their next meal was going to come from. And if you don't have a practice of doing that, I think you're missing out on some of those central passages of Scripture that says that's where we really have communion with Jesus.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think, Paul, you talk a lot about breaking bread and who we share the table with, and that being really important. And I think Jesus is always opening us up to new ways of breaking bread together and new people to invite to the table. And I think that one of our central Christian rituals is that of the Eucharist, and that I have to mention here is one of those things that we keep coming back to, and you don't have to pay for the Eucharist when you come up to the table. You don't have to pay for that piece of bread, but you know that it's valuable, and you know that it's sanctified, and that there's this mystery to it, and that there's something represented there from whatever church background you come from. And I think that just through sharing that meal together, there's a lot of deeper reminders, and maybe we can learn about food and about what sharing food means, what generosity means out of that meal, that it's broken, that they recognized him in the breaking of bread and then distributed, and everyone gets enough, everyone is fed, and you're all sharing the same meal. It's part of the same body. You're part of the same body of Christ. There's something just really profound, I think, about our ritual of the Eucharist. And being an anthropology major, I really love ritual. So I think other rituals that we've been experimenting with, where I'm at as part of the Abundant Table community, have been rediscovering ancient ones as part of the church. One of those that a priest in the area, an Episcopal priest, contacted me about recently. She wants to do a rogation days, and I looked these up, and they're these ancient rituals to celebrate the harvest, celebrate the hands of those who have worked with the harvest. And because ours is a large farm worker community, we're talking about celebrating the work of farm workers, people who are often unacknowledged, they're unseen in the fields, and celebrating rogation days. We did a Thanksgiving service on the farm for the land, and it takes on new meaning when your hands have harvested what you're thankful for, when you're in community with those people who have harvested what you're thankful for. And I think going back to this question of the church, our garden is actually on the land of this United Methodist Church. And one of the church members told me this is where we would have built a sanctuary if we had decided to expand. That's the center of the garden. So the church decided not to expand. They decided to limit themselves because they were a smaller congregation, and they thought, you know what, I think that we're going to concentrate more on our ministries in the community and our community engagement rather than expanding our building. So I think that was a pretty radical idea, and now they have this flourishing community garden where people from all over the community come on to that church land, speak with church members, talk with them. A lot of people who have problems with organized religion come there. And so I think it's widening people's perceptions of what the church can be or what the church can look like, and breaking down some boundaries in our community between church members and community members.
Well, you've all brought a lot of thought and a lot of experience to this, and you've also shared quite a few of your own questions as well. At this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience, just for you to interact with our panelists, to bring your questions that you have regarding local food movements, so we invite you.
Just wondered if I could get us started real quick. Sorry, Adam. We had a speaker here on Wednesday evening, was talking about, wrote a book called The Locavor's Dilemma in response to the omnivore's dilemma, and trying to piece out some of the economic and myths about local food movements and things. That was his approach. But one of the biggest, I think, critiques that he said, and that everyone needs to respond to, is one that you, Mark, mentioned. I'm wondering if we could flesh it out a little bit more. Is, do the numbers work? The numbers seem to work for the large scale. Can the numbers work for the small scale? Have you seen this happen, or is it, is this really impossible?
Yeah. First of all, I appreciated what you shared there, Kat. It's important that profitability doesn't become the sole motive, because if this just becomes a capitalistic vision, it's not a kingdom vision, and those are two very different things. So I appreciated your comments, but sort of couched within that framework of understanding that it's not all about profitability. What I would observe would be the following. One thing that I was sharing with Todd, who shared yesterday, we were speaking this morning a little bit, is with food security, we have this intricate connection with water security or water sovereignty as well. It's just as important. And in the Dominican Republic, which is a place where I've vested a number of years of my life, it's probably the most successful water security, food security, any kind of program I've seen has been local churches taking on water purification for themselves, almost taking it out of the hands of the corporations, to the extent of, probably in the city of Santo Domingo today, a city of 2.5 million, you've got 150, 200 churches with water filtration systems now. And the next thing that we've started to see them do is they equip a small truck to that church, and they put a small water rack that'll do 35-gallon jugs now in people's homes, in their patios. And it's just gotten crazy exciting. I mean, I'm smiling thinking about it right now, because I've met these families, and You know, it's just every little jug rack that gets put in somebody's patio, they make 5 pesos, which is like 12 cents. And so these people make $3, $4 a day like this, and they're still selling water to half the price of the local, you know, Agua Cristal, Planeta Azul, all those groups, which are the big watermongers who are in bed with the government. And so you've actually started to see them decrease their prices in a lot of these neighborhoods because they're just flat broke. They can't operate anymore. And it's been the church taking this on and then make it even more exciting, again, and more, I mean, it's healthy kingdom capitalism. Our microfinance partner there, Esperanza International, who's an affiliate of Hope International, you may be Peter Greer, he's the director of them. He's written he's written some good books. In any case, they've now got a rotating loan fund. So we're gonna be in 2 to 3 years as Willow Creek, as this US group, probably out of the whole equation. Because now, for instance, churches will get an 80% loan from Hope, and we'll get a 20% grant from Willow, and then they're gonna move to a full loan model where there's this, and it's all going back into this rotating loan fund. It's gonna be owned by this water co-op of all these churches, and we're gonna be all out as Americans, and it's just gonna be locally owned. They're gonna have $500,000 running in this rotating loan fund. You're gonna have thousands of micro businesses. And the thing that set this whole thing loose was that possibility for profitability. Because a woman that's just trying to feed her kids, she can't, you know, it's gotta be profitable or she can't do it, you know? She's gotta be able to make that $2 to $3 a day to make it worth it for her to sit at home with her water rack and sell her water, for instance. And so I'm seeing people do similar experience with co-ops with selling fruits and vegetables. So instead of all the small plot farmers, instead of wasting 50%, because even at the small plot the size of the stage, you go way more vegetables than one family can eat. But it all gets wasted because there's no market. So in El Salvador, somebody comes by and buys all their tomatoes up and goes to the market every day, and then they sell that and redistribute the profits. And the profitability is what motivates the people because they say it's worth it, you know? It's worth it to raise a little bit more. It's worth it to go share crop a little plot down the street as opposed to just doing something little. They start to dream big dreams. And so you know, that it is possible. It's very much possible. And I'm obviously passionate about it.
All right, somewhat related, but I'm going to be a little bit more specific maybe. I think if I remember correctly, last year's symposium was about cities. And I think this is interesting that urbanization is happening at the same time that we're talking about eat local type things. Maybe that's not such a coincidence. But the ways our cities, that the cities around the world, global north and global south, are designed are not geographically designed for perhaps, at least at this point, for, in my mind, I don't have much experience, for much, I don't know, food, urban, agricultural gardens, and the way our the labor arrangement of cities is also frequently not designed. So if I have 2 jobs, it's going to be very difficult. If I'm poor, it's going to be very difficult to start a garden.Maybe I'm wrong about both of those, but these are my perceptions. So how does Eat Local work in cities, and how, I think, Katarina, you have a vision for this, how this looks. So how does this work? How do we have how does Eat Local work, knowing that cities are only getting bigger?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're right. Cities have not been designed. Cities have been designed in the large part to be dependent on outside resources and imports, which oftentimes, or more often than not, I should say, creates inequalities and exploits the rural regions around the world. And so, yeah, how do you redesign cities? There's this interesting, actually, architectural movement that I think could be more connected with the local food movement called the New Urbanism that you could look into. I haven't done that much research into that, but it's interesting. They're reimagining what cities could look like, looking at common shared spaces since there aren't that many. And I think people are doing what they can, given the designs that they have, with cities to incorporate more green spaces, more gardens, more food production. We've run a workshop in Spanish called container gardening because there are a lot of people in our community who live in apartments who can't grow their own food. They don't have that small plot near their house, and yet they still want to be able to harvest what they can nearby where they are. So people around the world, and there's the name is escaping me right now, but there's a program, faith-based program in Florida right now that someone here might be able to think of the name of. What's that? Echo, right, that has, I've seen a lot of their slides of pictures of the container gardens that they've been able to develop out of these old grain sacks, out of buckets, different kinds of materials, tires. They're just experimenting with all different kinds of new ways to grow food within cities, on rooftops, in spaces that you wouldn't think that food could grow, and using very little money, very little inputs too. Using what people have on hand. So I think it's a big challenge, but also another thing I would add to that is also what's the city's relationship like, and maybe looking at, okay, let's not become provincial within the city itself, but look at what is the relationship like with the countryside around it, and trying to create connections between the two. Like community-supported agriculture is now dropping off in lots of churches, going back to the how churches can get involved. Community kitchens are becoming big, where people can come together to grow and cook and produce and sell their own food out of churches. Buyers co-ops, places places within the city, whether it's churches or other places, can have relationships with people who are producing more higher scale food on outside land. So a few thoughts.
Arloa, would you have anything to?
No, not really. Well, just in response to like the numbers and making the numbers work, I think that is a challenge, and I think you start small, and it's like touchy-feely, kumbaya, let's get together and get our fingers in the dirt and watch things grow, and then eat what we grow, and that's nice. But in terms of the numbers, there's some struggles in the Midwest. The temperatures affect the growing season, and we have a pretty short growing season, so you got to get it in just in that window of time, and then you got to harvest, and maybe you're busy at either end of that, and things fall behind. So that there's that, and then doing indoor farming with the aquaponics, hydroponics, all that, the vertical gardens indoors, there's the heat. You have to keep these buildings kind of warm during the winter. So I think there's a lot of experimenting to be done to try to find out. Let's do some pilot tests and see what we can do, even on a small scale, and then ramp it up. One person who I know is amazing is Will Allen. So most of you probably have heard of Will Allen. If you haven't, go to YouTube and put his name in. And he in Milwaukee started Growing Power, and his daughter Erica is now carrying it out in Chicago. And it's really, they've got worm composting, and they're growing alfalfa sprouts and selling them to the restaurants. And I just want to be like him someday, at Breakthrough. But that's, I think he's doing it. I think they're making the numbers work for them. So, but I think we need more of these models. I'm not seeing a whole lot of them, to be honest.
No, and I would say the key thing here, from my perspective, that you see time and again, is it's the direct sales approach. You got to cut out all these middle people, and you also have to cut out diesel fuel. I mean, if we have to transport this stuff a long way, it kills these sorts of initiatives, because diesel fuel is just gasoline's too expensive. And so if you can grow and produce products that we bought back in your own community, that's also got a good flywheel effect from an economic development perspective, because you can keep resources moving in the same community instead of people going to the mega stores on the outside. And then they don't have to pay for bus fares or whatever to buy things elsewhere too. It's reinventing the local community. And there's obvious, being in more a tropical latitude brings a lot of, brings that year-round growing. And so, yeah, in more temperate climates, there's a whole set of challenges there that I'm not, I wish I had answers on.
There's a real fun book, and she doesn't claim to be a Christian, but I think the name of it is Farm City, and it's this woman that grew her own stuff in Oakland, California, and it's just hilarious how she ends up, getting bigger and bigger, and has these 2 big pigs, in her backyard, and how she has to butcher them. And I mean, it's just, but it just is so captivating for you to just, it got me passionate about it. I want to do that, on my back porch. So there's, I think if we challenge each other to just try some of these things, and then it can be contagious and catch on, and the cool thing to do in the city.
Everybody loves homemade chicharrón, so.
Yeah, yeah, and chickens, we can all grow chickens. Not in Chicago, not roosters, but we can raise chickens. So I'm hoping to do that with my neighbors this summer.
Absolutely.
And one more point, sorry, on the urban food production, I should say, is oftentimes, we can't produce, or people are separated from the food production, but everyone produces waste, and looking at how much waste our system produces. Just throwing out a movie that recently came out of LA called Dive, about a dumpster diving culture, produced by a guy who's a Christian, who's really convicted and concerned about how much waste is coming out of cities, and looking at how much of it can be reclaimed.
And speaking of waste, though, I thought you were going to talk about human waste.
There you go. Talk about
I've
that.
seen a lot of, with these latrines, LASF latrines, I don't even know what it stands for, you can make pretty good garden compost out of human. You're also solving a lot of health issues and water supply issues simultaneously, and so it is amazing what you can get out of a small plot of land when you're just conserving and reusing.
I don't know if we can do that in Chicago, the human latrine thing.
I speak from a global perspective.
But there are food rescue teams that do go
Yeah,
dumpster diving,
right.
and we have arrangements with Whole Foods and Trader Joe's, to get some of their almost expired food. So there's a lot we can be doing.
Thank you very much for your sharing. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I stumbled upon this issue of food and water security when I visited a township in South Africa. And it was a project on trying to understand what were some of the factors that influenced adherence to antiretroviral medication for those living with HIV. And when I spoke to the folks there, they said the one thing, HIV is a huge issue in our township. The prevalence and incidence was off the roof. However, the one issue that we contend with continuously is food and malnourishment, and also water security. So I stumbled upon this serendipitously. So I guess my question to you is, in this issue of food security and water security, I'm quite a newbie in the field as a clinical psychologist. What are some of the other issues that you found this issue intersect with that was quite surprising to you? For me, my area is in HIV, and I stumbled across food security and water security, and I was quite surprised, but it's very relevant. What are some of the issues that y'all have seen that surprised you in terms of what are the issues that food security intersected with?
I can start with a few, because I think there's so many around the world. Violence, conflict, all these kinds of things that can create food security. In our area, we're doing a research project that's on farm worker food security and the needs and resources of the farm worker community in our area around realizing greater community food security. So it's a planning project. So right now we're just doing some surveys in the area and surveying farm workers on some of their ideas on how to improve food security, some of the challenges and barriers in our area, and some of the things that we've come up with. And we're doing this together with an organization that works for farm worker rights, as well as farmers, large scale, small scale. We have a steering committee with lots of different community members to give input, and some of what they've said and some of what our surveys are asking about is time is a huge issue. People are overworked, and I think a lot of us might be able to identify with that. We don't have time to grow and cook and produce and process our own food. So that's a big one. So you rely on quick, easy, fast foods or on processed, packaged foods. Another one is income. A lot of people, of course, can't afford the food when you're making, $12,000 to $15,000 a year as a farm worker. You have to decide between rent and food, and we live in a high cost for housing area. So another big one is housing. So as we go deeper and deeper, we keep on encountering these bigger and bigger issues where it's not just about food security, but it's about access to affordable housing. It's about living wage. It's about immigration status, because a lot of people who are undocumented farm workers don't have the perception that they can't access food assistance programs, or are living in a place where they aren't making enough to afford their own food. So those are just some of the things that I've encountered in my work.
And in what I do, and maybe it's my personality, I struggle with everything is connected, right? It really is connected. So because of food insecurity and because of people going to the neighborhood corner stores and getting highly processed food that's not very nutritious, and there's heart disease, hypertension, diabetes is rampant in our neighborhood. And then you think about, I've got grandkids now, and I know my daughter just yells at me because I'll give them sugar. I'll just say, yeah, sure, go, and then I see like half an hour later, they're bouncing off the walls. And you think about if your diet is such that you're not eating right, and then you go to school and you try to learn, and you're antsy. And then, we work hard in our neighborhood to bring businesses to our neighborhood because we want to see economic development. And we had Dominic's, the major food chain, come right down the street at Roosevelt and Holman, and everybody's excited. And like, I don't know how many years later, 5-6 years later, it's out of business. And so it's not even just trying to get these businesses to come and giving them new market tax credits and tax increment financing and say, come to our neighborhood, because people in our neighborhood don't have money to buy things. So the businesses go out of business. So it really does then coil down to economic development. And I like, obviously, Brian Williams and Rock Center had this segment on Williston, North Dakota. It was this kind of ghost town that was dying out. And then this geologist comes in, he finds oil, right? And he starts drilling these oil wells. And pretty soon, there's more oil, and people are coming and they're getting jobs. And now if you go to Williston, North Dakota, there's not enough housing, there's not enough hotels, you have to sleep in your car, there's tent cities, they can't build schools fast enough, they can't find grocery stores fast enough, because it's all about the economy now has switched so that businesses want to go to Williston, North Dakota because of the demand. And so it's all kind of related. We've got to find oil in our neighborhoods, so to speak, so that people can afford to buy the groceries from Dominic's, and then Dominic's will be the first one to show up. So it's all very related to economic development. Poverty just is suffocating to the people in our neighborhood.
I think my only statement would be, it's not cool to farm. I mean, I think most of what I see in a lot of Latin America, at least, is the big box stores that we've kind of gotten tired of in the U.S. Those exact same chains, or chains that they own, but they brand a little bit differently, or actually distinct chains. But the big chain stores, the mega stores, and buying from those stores, people feel successful when they've gotten to a place where that's where now I'm buying my food. I got out of the campo, I got out of the countryside, and now I'm in the big city, and I want to leave that behind. There's that mentality, and I'd rather give my child formula rather than breast milk. It's all kind of comes with the same kind of almost modernist notion that it's foreign to us now because we've sort of gone through that cycle here. But that's what I see, but it doesn't work for people, even though that's the vision. The vision actually is not very life-giving. So how do you move people into a more life-giving vision than the vision that culture is selling? The church has got a big role in that. The church doesn't do a great job with it always, but I think the church has a big role in that.
And I would add maybe also to that is the lack of community ties in a lot of our urban communities, maybe in even a deeper sense. And maybe those are some of the reasons for deeper food insecurity issues. And I want to bring up the example of Detroit. I don't know if anyone's been to Detroit recently, but they hit oil, and they had a huge booming car industry. And what happened? And they had to find out after that collapsed, how to reform a resilient community and how to reform those community ties. And urban agriculture has been one of those things, and there's a lot of other ways too. But I think if anyone wants to look at a model, there's one that's starting to regrow now in Detroit.
I had a question about just food safety in general, and how food safety has to do with sovereignty and security. In America, obviously, we're very concerned about our food Campylobacter, E. coli. How does that play in with building global food markets in particular?
You two are probably better prepared.
Well, yeah, when we were talking and starting this initiative of doing our little garden, and we have a woman who, several volunteers who are part of the food safety corporate environment, and you know, where you buy your seeds is real important, and how you treat them before they're put in the ground, and then how things are stored. And you know, frankly, we're very careful about in the food rescue. We serve, you know, meals to 200 people every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and so we have to be careful what we use. You know, those expired dates are there for a purpose, and so you know, so safety is a huge part of, I think, one of the checkpoints that we have to always keep in mind.
Well, I'd like to pose just one final question. I think we're getting to the end of our time here, but just in terms of the broader symposium theme of advocacy, one of the issues that you've brought up is you know, the question of who's upriver, and it seems like a lot of times you've been coming back to the idea of who owns the land, like where are those, who's controlling those avenues of access. So I guess I'd just like to hear briefly from each of you maybe one point on how land redistribution and agrarian reform fit into these ideas of food sovereignty, and what is the role of the church in that? As a way to close.
Go ahead,
I can
Mark.
start. I never have a problem talking. So I would say that land redistribution is such a tricky point because it's a political point, plain and simple, and many denominations and many believers don't, while they'll vote and they believe that they should be educated politically, there's not a desire to engage politically. And the other thing too, Paul spoke to this yesterday when we were just talking a little bit, the evangelicalism or the fundamentalist Protestant religion that was exported to much of the developing world by our, you know, there were elements of that were wonderful, and we see throngs of worshiping believers in many countries today that love God and love their neighbor. But one of the things I don't think that was exported with that gospel was a holistic viewpoint, and there definitely wasn't a political, they certainly didn't have a theology of politics, wasn't embedded in that gospel. And so one of the hardest challenges on this is that the local church in most of the developing contexts where I'm aware just doesn't see it even part of the gospel's imperative to, not to be powered up politicians, but to just even be advocates. You see what I'm saying? It's just, so there's a reframing of, a re-understanding of what the gospel might have to say to that. And that's a very delicate process on how you engage in helping people open up their understanding of what Christ asked for from us from a political standpoint. But I don't think until you clear that hurdle, do you really get a sense, can the church really engage? You know, that when the church clears that hurdle, the rest is just dominoes, you know. The other tricky thing is to what degree that's just so not effective that you just start to work through the political structures as a Christian. You know, that's the thing we struggle with as Willow Creek sometimes is we're all about the local church, but when do we just do parallel initiatives in the same communities because we realize the church is so far behind, but there's a few impassioned Christians here. So we're not going to give up the local church fight, but we've got to just work with somebody else in the community to get a couple things done that will actually benefit the local church ultimately, even though the local church doesn't realize that. And so those are sort of the required questions to ask her on that point. The local church is almost not prepared for that most places, but we need to be preparing them even though it's hard.
I think that's a hard question. I think it's hard to find examples that the church is actually doing, and that there are, I think, a lot of examples around the world that are coming from below, and changes happening from below. The landless peasant workers movement in Brazil, where peasants are occupying huge haciendas, which haven't been used in years, and are starting to grow food for themselves and their families. I think that the South Central farmers of Los Angeles is another example. After the LA race riots, they were given 14 acres in this blighted neighborhood, which actually had a lot of resources in terms of agricultural knowledge, but the people were in the city and they wanted a farm for themselves. So the city gave them 14 acres in the heart of Los Angeles. They called it the lungs of LA because it was this huge 14-acre green space. And until I think it was about 5 years ago, that was there where people could grow their own food for themselves and their families until the city got a better deal from someone for the land. They bought it and bulldozed the garden. And I think that it's really hard. So there are a lot of stories like that that happen around the world. And I think maybe the church, one thing I would say is being radicalized by the stories of Jesus and going back to our scriptures and our own tradition and rehearing them in new ways. I think that's one thing that I've been learning a lot about where I am right now, and a lot of the feeding stories of Jesus. Jesus walking through the fields on the Sabbath, and the authorities getting angry with him because he was picking the grains and eating with his disciples, and reclaiming that this food is for those who are in need, and this is the real meaning of the Sabbath. And maybe if we start taking the Sabbath seriously and going back and looking at the tradition of Jubilee, that we'll be able to reclaim some of the subversive and more radical things that would make it possible for churches to get on board with some of these more radical initiatives. Another one that I would say is feeding of the 5,000, that the food didn't come from outside. The disciples wanted to go outside to the villages and the cities and find food, but Jesus said, no, share what you have. You can do it. And 5,000 people were fed. How did that happen? Eating, sharing bread, breaking bread around the table, going back to those stories in Scripture, and being radicalized by them, I think would be what I would hope for for myself and for the church.
I'll just say a little short thing. My mother still owns land in northwest Iowa. In 2008, it was worth $6,000 an acre. Now a farm sold nearby for $20,000 an acre. It appreciated by 32% in the last year during this heart of the recession. Now these farmers, they're speculators that are buying this land because they realize how valuable farmland is, and at one time you could have a family farm for 180, 200 acres. Now it's 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 acres, and there's big corporations buying up this land. So I'm just saying, this movement is radical and it's anti-status quo, and we're going to have to reclaim some of that space, and especially in our cities, and be very creative, because we're coming up against corporate farming, and it's going to change the way we eat and what we eat, and we're going to have to be pretty radical to come up against that, I think.
Let's give this panel a hand. We are going to reconvene in 15 minutes, so let's at 5 after 11. I just want to say one thing. I am deeply moved by the way that you have turned this conversation to a theological question. One of our friends, David Kasali of Congo, argues as a theologian. He says, theology demands a context that gives it, it's a context that gives it meaning and purpose. And what you've given us is a context for our theology, and shown us right back to what God has called us to in the Scriptures. And I do believe that the Scriptures do give us our answers. David Beckman spoke yesterday about Jubilee in 2000. The Jubilee movement that grew out of the churches basically redefined global debt and how we respond to global debt, and offered a way out of that that really has transformed many of the countries in the majority world. I'm convinced that the same thing, an understanding of what God's purposes are as far as hunger and as far as meeting the needs of hunger is found in the Scriptures, and it centers on exactly what you're talking about, the Eucharist, in both of its forms in the New Testament. We don't realize that because we've almost basically given up the second form, but in its original form it had two components. One was the loaves and the fishes, and the other was the bread and the wine. What if we bring those together in really profound ways as we think about solving the world's food problems? So thank you very much.